Welcome to the Inside Elections podcast. It's the podcast where we analyze elections in a nonpartisan, data-driven, and accessible way. In this episode, we'll go over the latest results in House primaries in Ohio and Illinois. We'll set the stage for one of this cycle's biggest Senate races. And we'll take a look at some upcoming primaries in one very important Commonwealth. And we'll do it all with the help of a special guest, who you may recognize. Buckle up. I'm Jacob Rubashkin, Deputy Editor of Inside Elections, the go-to place for nonpartisan political analysis for more than 40 years. And I just spent the weekend in New Jersey's 7th Congressional District, which is represented by Republican Tom Kean Jr.
And I'm Nathan Gonzales, editor and publisher of Inside Elections, and I just got back from Florida's 9th District, where I was speaking to the National Grain and Feed Association in the Orlando area. This is the western edge of Democrat Darren Soto's district, which makes sense because he was on my flight down there.
And Nathan, you almost didn't recognize him, right?
Yeah, he's shorter than what I remembered, but I'm pretty sure it was him. We can confirm with his office later.
They need to include height on the little flashcards they give the interns. I want to welcome our special guest to the podcast, Erin Covey of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, but more importantly, Erin Covey, formerly of Inside Elections and the Inside Elections podcast. Welcome, Erin. Great to have you with us.
Hey, everyone. Good to be back.
So
nothing changed.
It all comes from. I love Erin. I love that you're on because I get a question a lot that whether our friends at the Cook Report, are they friends or competitors? And the answer is yes. Like the answer is yes. Like we have publications, but we're also friends. It's a small world. So thank you for coming back.
Well, you guys saw on election Twitter, someone's doing a bracket with all the election forecasters, and we're pitted against each other, which is awkward for me. But I do feel like this means, like, regardless of who wins, I'm a winner, since I have worked for both.
It's not going well for us. I could.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
That's all right. You can still stay on the podcast.
We gotta bring the mules in. We gotta bring the.
I know.
Our 2,000 mules.
If Mike Pence has the courage, you can change this.
Bring the suitcases out. We're delivering the suitcases soon.
So, Erin, you have already answered all of the intro questions we normally throw at guests. So we'll just default to an easy one. Have you traveled to any congressional districts for any reason in the last couple days, weeks, time?
So period? I have not gone on any trips since the beginning of this year. But I do go to Virginia's 8th district like every weekend, because it's where my boyfriend lives. So I guess that counts. It's a medium distance relationship.
All the way across.
I think crossing the Potomac counts as long distance.
I've said goodbye to friends who moved across the river. So.
So I broke news earlier this week that a super PAC affiliated with the Club for Growth, a big anti-tax group, and mega donor Dick Uihlein, one of their biggest donors, big figure in Republican politics, is uncorking a $1.8 million ad buy in the Utah Senate Republican primary to support lawyer Brent Orrin Hatch. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Brent Orrin Hatch's father, Orrin Hatch, held this Senate seat in Utah for 42 years before retiring in 2018. The PAC is now the biggest spender in this primary, which of course is to succeed Mitt Romney, who's retiring after just one term. The primary also features Congressman John Curtis and State House Speaker Brad Wilson.
Yeah, and I think we were the first to also tell folks that Representative John Curtis was making calls in preparation of a run ahead of that announcement. But Jacob, what is this primary? I guess, what did it look like before this influx of money, and what do we think is going to happen? Who's going to win?
Oh gosh. Well, I don't know who's going to win. What I do know is that even before this ad buy came down, Brent Hatch was among the top polling figures in the race, basically off of the strength of his name. I mean, he is not a known figure in the state's politics, but there was a Deseret News poll that tested this primary, and it found Curtis in the front, but with just under 20% of the vote, and then Hatch very closely behind him, and then Wilson a little further back. So clearly, an open field already. I think this money is going to be a real problem for Curtis and for Wilson because the club will spend very heavily on races that it's engaged in. And while Wilson has some personal money, and while Curtis has some wealthy backers, actually in the Republican clean energy space, which is not necessarily what we think of in the larger kind of climate change focused sector of politics, but there are some Republican donors who are very focused on climate change who have seeded a PAC that is supporting Curtis. So, look, I think this race is going to be highly competitive. Utah has this kind of more intricate primary system with an assembly and then also a primary. So we'll see which direction these candidates go in to try and get on the ballot, who finally makes the ballot. But we know a Republican's going to win this race at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I haven't checked out Hatch's campaign signs, but I wonder if they're going to say Orrin Hatch in big letters and then Brent, like very small at the top or not. But a new Emerson College poll in Arizona had a couple interesting tidbits. First of all, it had Trump leading Biden in the presidential matchup 48 to 44%. That would be significant considering Biden won Arizona narrowly in 2020. And if Biden doesn't win Arizona and Georgia this time around, then he has to run the table of Nevada, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. But the poll also had Republican Kari Lake running 8 points behind Trump and losing the Senate race to Democratic Congressman Ruben Gallego 44 to 40. So that's got to have, that dynamic, or Gallego winning, has to happen in order for Democrats to have any chance of holding on to control of the Senate.
Yeah, I don't think that poll is incorrect necessarily in where it ended up. The sheer amount of data that Emerson is putting out right now almost makes me more skeptical of any individual poll that they're doing. I'll give you a brief readout of the methodology. And Nathan, this is not to stomp on your headline here, but data was collected by contacting an interactive voice response system of landlines and a consumer list of emails, both provided by Aristotle, and an online panel of voters provided by Alchemer, which is three kind of mid-tier ways of conducting surveys. I would argue. I think that polling is expensive. Good polling is even more expensive. And if they're polling every single state in the country, which it looks like they are, I just wonder how much any individual poll is being properly resourced. So while I don't doubt that Biden is probably down in Arizona and Gallego's probably up, gosh, every time I see an Emerson poll, I don't know what to think.
Yeah, and this does line up with the dynamic though of Trump basically winning at least by a few points all of the swing states. I mean, I'm not sure if there's a poll, maybe they're running closer to even in Wisconsin, but Trump has maintained this very narrow lead. I think that could change over the next few months, but it is wise to look at polling numbers with a bit of skepticism.
And Erin, what should we not miss this week?
I mean, we're covering a lot of the big news from this week in a few minutes, but there are still a few California races that haven't been called yet because they take forever to count their votes. And one that I am really closely watching is in the Bay Area. This is an open seat that Sam Liccardo, the former mayor of San Jose, came in first place for, but the race for second place is currently neck and neck between Evan Lowe, a state assemblyman who has a 3-point lead right now over Joe Simidian. So
3-point or 3-vote?
3-vote. Excuse me. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, 3 votes.
It's a 3-vote lead. Yeah. And it's been going back and forth between them for the past week. And I think, who knows how long it's going to take to call it. One of them could pay for a recount after the fact. But this is a very blue seat. And so the general election could be competitive depending on how well funded the second place finisher is. I think Sam Liccardo is probably the favorite, but it could be a really interesting race to watch. And, only a couple of voters are going to determine who sends their next member to Congress.
Yeah, I always like elections like this because we hear a lot. I certainly hear a lot, and I think both of you probably do as well from friends and colleagues. Skepticism about how much does your vote really count, right? Oh, why should I go and vote? My vote doesn't matter. And then every so often we get one of these elections that's decided literally by votes you can count on one hand. I mean, Rita Hart versus Marionette Miller Meeks in that Iowa district in 2020, the Anthony Brindisi, Claudia Tenney, and now this one. I mean, I think this one would be certainly the closest of the bunch if it remains in that like one or two or three vote category. Your vote matters, right? I mean, if you need proof, it's right there in the results of this congressional district. The other interesting thing that I learned, I didn't know this before, is that what happens if the candidates tie? And as it turns out,
Yeah.
if they tie, they both go to the general election. You get
And it's happened once before, right? Which is
yeah,
crazy.
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
what are the odds?
Slim, but not none, I guess.
Yeah.
But the thing that is really weighing on me though is obviously this is a primary. There's plenty of time before the general election, but a lot of these California races were expecting to be very close general election fights between Democrats and Republicans. And the House is so evenly divided that it's not difficult to see a universe in which control of the House comes down to a set of close, uncalled California races that
Yeah.
we are going to be waiting weeks, if not a month. I mean, I think the state has a month to do their official vote tally after Election Day. We might not know who controls Congress because California takes so long to count its votes.
Yeah. And the unfortunate thing is that some people will use that time frame to sow seeds of distrust in the system, and I think that everyone benefits from trust in the electoral system, so that the winners are, viewed as legitimate winners and taking office and making laws for this country.
All right, on that positive note, let's get to our main stories of the day. So, another two states went to the polls to pick their nominees for Congress this week: Ohio and Illinois. Each state had a handful of highly competitive House primaries. And of course, there was that very competitive Senate primary in Ohio as well. But let's start with the House and in Illinois.
So I ran against an opponent that had ran for governor. He had a very strong name recognition. I supported him for governor.
That was Congressman Mike Bost, who narrowly won his primary Tuesday night, I believe 51.49% against former state Senator Darren Bailey. Now, Nathan, you wrote a story earlier this week ahead of this primary outlining why, in fact, Bost might be in some real danger of losing as an incumbent to his challenger Bailey. What were the reasons why Bost was in such a tough fight, and how did he ultimately pull it out?
Well, before we even get to this week, I've been fascinated by this district for 10 years because when Mike Boss was first elected, he was viewed as he. There was this viral video of him on the floor of the state house where he was throwing a tantrum and he threw these papers up and he was quoting Moses, "Let my people go," and Democrats thought, "Wow, we've got this guy." Dead in the water politically, and they put that ad on TV and they thought people would reject him when actually that anger resonated in downstate in southern Illinois, and he ended up winning. And so now it was an odd race because Mike Bost was portrayed as the establishment, rhino in the race. And Darren Bailey came on and challenged him. And Bailey, this race was unique because Bailey lost the 2022 race for governor, but he won this district handily at the gubernatorial level, and he came to this race with high name ID, positive name ID among Republican voters. And even though Bost had a extreme financial advantage on TV, they still had fairly even name ID. And when Trump endorsed Bost in this race, Darren Bailey on the campaign trail, I was told by sources in Southern Illinois, Darren Bailey did everything he could to blur the lines because Trump endorsed him in the governor's race, and he didn't want to make those distinctions with voters, and so we had a very close race. Ultimately, I think that fundraising advantage and having the Trump endorsement more currently, helped put Bost across the line. But this was a very close race.
Well, and it's ironic because it seems like the reason Trump didn't end up endorsing Bailey again was because he was annoyed that Bailey didn't tout his endorsement enough in the governor's race. Which, obviously in a governor's race in Illinois, I don't know how much you want to do that.
Right.
But Bailey is obviously much more within that kind of MAGA wing of the party. Bost is super conservative as well. But yeah, I mean, I think this Trump endorsement probably pulled him over the line. I don't know if he would have won without it, even with the big financial advantage that he had.
Yeah, and this had ramifications for Capitol Hill because, Aaron, as you alluded to, Bailey was also supported by Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz. Bailey was part of a group of Republicans in Southern Illinois known as the Eastern Bloc Republicans, who were affiliated with the State Freedom Caucus network. And so Darren Bailey would have been coming in hot to Capitol Hill, and
Yeah.
and Bost chairman, but Bost being chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee ended up becoming a serious legislator, and someone who I know interests down there were kind of hoping would win because they've come to know him and rely on him for their work.
Right. Right. Yeah.
The other thing I think that was interesting here is, this is obviously this isn't a redistricting year. There was another redistricting. The redistricting happened before the 2022 cycle, but I think you can pin a lot of Bost's issues on the changes that were made to his district. Democrats really did some real tough gerrymandering in Illinois this past cycle, and one of the things they did was kind of combine a lot of Republican areas in the southern part of the state together. And so, if you look at the map, right, Bost wins all of the counties kind of evenly. If you divide the district in two, north south, he wins all the counties on the western side of the district, Southern Illinois, and Darren Bailey is winning all the counties on the eastern side of the district. Lo and behold, Mike Bost's old district was on the western side, and Darren Bailey's old state senate district was on the eastern side. So redistricting, it wasn't obviously immediately prior to this race, but clearly had an effect on the congressman's standing and his challenger's standing in this newly drawn seat.
And I was very surprised on election night. Bailey conceded very early. He conceded before this race was called by, I believe, the AP or DDHQ. And I know, so for someone who was trying to do everything he could to beat Trump, to concede so early was very strange. And the margin narrowed considerably from the moment that he conceded to what's going to be that final 51-49 result. So I was surprised. And I know I was getting a lot of texts from folks they were surprised as well.
Well, I think, look, we saw in 2022, right? There was this open question after 2020 and Trump's refusal to concede his loss. This question of whether all of the Trump affiliated candidates would act similarly if and when they lost in 22. And with the very notable exception, I think, of Carrie Lake, who I just saw is appealing her loss to the Supreme Court for what, like the 15th time. I mean, everyone else pretty much went quietly when they lost their races. So I think it was surprising to see Bailey do that as early as he did, but certainly not out of the norm of kind of Trump aligned candidates in the last couple of years. I also want to talk about a Democratic primary in the 7th district, which is the west side of Chicago. Danny Davis is I believe, one of the oldest members of Congress. though he's only 82, so honestly, there could be
Only.
30 members, 30 members older than him. But Erin, you've written a little bit about Danny Davis in the past and his primary challenges. This is the third or fourth cycle in a row that he's had a pretty serious primary challenge, and yet he continues to win. What did you see there coming out of Tuesday night?
Yeah, so his margin of victory in the primary was about the same as what it was in 2022, actually. But the difference was that time he only had one serious opponent, Keena Collins, who had also run in 2020. But this time he faced two serious opponents. He had Keena Collins and then Melissa Conyers Irvin, who was the Chicago City Treasurer and was very well connected, had the support of the Chicago Teachers Union, raised more money than both Collins and Davis. And so her and Collins were kind of splitting the anti-Davis vote. Now, politically, they're very different. Conyers Irvin, much more moderate. Collins is super progressive. And I think there was some thought that Conyers Irvin would be better positioned to cut into more of Davis's margin. But ultimately, I mean, it was a super low turnout race, even for a primary. And Davis got a little over 50% of the votes and was way ahead of both the challengers, who each got around 20%. So it didn't end up being that close. His age had kind of come up in a way that it hadn't before. I think the conversations around Biden's age and electability has kind of put some of these older members of Congress under the spotlight as well, for that same reason. And so that was kind of interesting to see that being addressed openly. But yeah, ultimately was not that close.
Yeah, at 82 years old, he could have run for president. He could have just
It's
forgot
true.
reelection. But Aaron, you have to talk about what you have tweeted about before with some of the AI
Oh,
imaging
yeah.
with Congressman Davis. Just try to summarize. Maybe we can find some photos to accompany this on the YouTube version. But just kind of describe what you found. This was a few months ago.
Yeah, it was super weird. Basically, and so at the time, I noticed that the photos that were used on his website, several of them appeared to be AI generated. They didn't look like him. They had all the kind of telltales of an AI generated image. But yeah, initially when I had reached out to his campaign about it, they had kind of tried to avoid the question and asked if I was asking about AI policy, which I was obviously not. So I didn't really get a straight answer from them. But then a couple months later, ABC7 did a follow up story, and they got a comment from the campaign, and the campaign um, manager admitted to using AI generated photos. And she said, and this is a direct quote from her, it was because she had trouble getting the congressman well groomed, which is, a sad state of affairs, to say the least. And so I think that just further highlighted how much of an issue age was in this
Yeah.
race. Though ultimately, most voters didn't care about that as much.
Yeah. And the last note I'll make on Illinois before we move over to Ohio is both in this race and in another primary in Chicago, the 11th district where Bill Foster faced a primary challenge. We saw APAC and its affiliated Super PAC get involved in favor of both incumbents. So they spent a little bit of money in favor of Danny Davis, hitting Keena Collins, and they also spent some money in favor of Bill Foster, who beat his progressive challenger 77 to 23%. But I want to keep it moving to Ohio. We had some pretty big House primaries in the Buckeye State as well.
Well, after a controversial and heated race, we now know who is moving on to face off against Democratic Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur.
Yeah, take a look at the results. Derek Marin wins it tonight as the results continue to come in.
The biggest Republican primary of the night in Ohio, in the House at least, was probably in the 9th district, where Republicans are trying very hard to unseat Democratic Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, who has held her Toledo area seat since, I believe, the 1980s. She is the longest serving woman ever in Congress at this point. And she represents a district that Trump would have carried by about 3 points. It was a real roller coaster of a primary. ultimately the winner, Derek Marin, is a young guy, comes out of the state assembly, and was a pretty late entrant in the race. Erin, were you surprised that Marin ultimately was the candidate that was able to pull out a win here in the ninth district, given all the craziness of this primary over the last couple months?
No, I don't think so, and I feel like I should, like, give the Spark Notes version of what happened here for those who weren't following along. Basically, J.R. Majewski, if you listen to this podcast, you probably know who he is. Incredibly baggage nominee who ran against Captor last cycle. She managed to win by double digits, which was a huge shock considering the partisan lean of this district. But Majewski had gone back and forth about whether he was running here or not this cycle for a couple of times, then appeared to be in the race. And would have been the front runner just by virtue of the fact that he was the nominee last time, and obviously, despite being a polarizing figure, still had a bit of a base in the area. But then you also had Craig Riedel, who was a state senator, or excuse me, former state representative, who had lost to Majewski in the 2022 primary. He was running again, and initially he was the one that basically all the Republican leaders in the House kind of rallied behind in an effort to make sure that Majewski didn't become the nominee again. But then Riedel got caught saying some Trump critical comments. They weren't even that anti-Trump. This is a guy who's
Very
supported
mild.
Trump, very, very mild. But then people started scrambling because there was then, I think, concern that, okay, Trump might then endorse Majewski, which would give him an even greater advantage in the primary. And so in an effort to try to keep Trump out of things, they got Derek Marin, this other state rep who represents the Toledo area, to get in the race at the last minute. So Marin did not have much time, did not appear to raise much money at all, didn't spend any money on ads at all, but he had the Congressional Leadership Fund, which is a super PAC affiliated with the speaker, spending, I think it was around like $600,000 for him on TV and radio at the end of the day. And so they were able to boost him heavily. They were just largely all positive ads for him. Riedel was also spending quite a bit. But, ultimately, I think also there was the geographic advantage that Marin had helped here too, because he represented the more populated part of the district, whereas Riedel was in the more rural kind of northwestern Ohio corner. So I don't think it was a huge surprise at the end of the day. Trump also did endorse Marin at the very last minute, like the day before. So I don't know how much of an impact that had, but certainly could have been a factor.
Yeah. I think the big thing for Republicans is not having Majewski as their candidate again.
Right.
They were able to push him out of the race a second time, just a couple weeks before election day. But he, according to Inside Elections vote above replacement, he was the worst Republican House candidate in 2022. Of all 435 or however many Republicans were on the ballot in 2022, he was the worst candidate. And so no matter what, it's a big deal for Republicans that they got somebody else on the ticket for this cycle against Captor. But I think this district is a good opportunity maybe to get in the weeds a bit about some of the differences, perhaps, in approach that we have here at Inside Elections with our ratings and what you guys do over at the Cook Political Report. And Erin, I think you're probably the person most uniquely situated to talk about this, given your current and past experience. But you have this district rated as toss up, right? Um, and we have it rated as lean Democratic. Um, I guess walk us through kind of what your approach is to assigning ratings to districts at the Cook Report.
So I do feel like I'm a little outnumbered here, I will say. I think
We're all
should have brought Dave
friends.
on for this
We're all friends.
to make this a little more even. But
we can patch him in. We can patch him in.
Yeah, I think so. This was one that we debated quite a bit on whether to move it to toss up or not. We had a lot of conversations about this, Dave and I, and Amy and the whole team. I think, ironically, I think this is one seat where having the tilt category helps And if I had, I probably would have been more inclined to put it in a tilt category because of how conflicted we were about it at the end of the day. But I do think that we have to acknowledge that it's going to be, I mean, Capture, is an institution in this district. She has been there for 40 years. But, she has not had an actually competitive race since she was first elected because of the way 2022 went. I mean, after all the stuff about Majewski exaggerating his military record came out, all the Republicans pulled out entirely. There was no spending on behalf of him, no negative ads that went after Capture. So she had like an incredibly lopsided situation, and that did help her ahead of this primary because it actually allowed her to like get her name ID up in the new district, which was significantly different than her old district that she had represented for a while. And so I think, I think I would probably still say within this toss-up category, there are some races where we can say, okay, well, this congressman or this congressman or congresswoman is probably still favored, but we think it's going to be quite close and Republicans have a very good chance of winning here. And I think that's the case with this district. I will say also in a presidential cycle, this is not a part of the country that Biden really, I think, has any shot at winning, even though it was pretty close. Trump +3 in 2020. I think a lot of folks who I've talked to on both sides expect Trump to win by at least as much as he did then. And so I think that'll also make it more difficult. But, who knows? We'll see. It's kind of a risk because Marin, I think one of the main differences between the way we change ratings is we're a little more reactive to developments in the news cycle than y'all are. So I think, if, Marin proves himself to be a weak candidate, a weak nominee, we might move it back to Lindsay. We'll see.
And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. We have next week will be our House overview where we update close to 100 races and including and reevaluating our ratings. And I don't know, Jacob and I haven't had this conversation, so it's good to have it live on a podcast. But I would anticipate us really thinking strongly about utilizing our tilts category for this race, as you kind of laid out. Because you're right, the most competitive race she has really had was actually a primary against Dennis Kucinich, the former congressman who ran for
That's
president
true.
multiple
Yeah.
times, and that was because of redistricting, and that was years ago, and that wasn't even a general election as you laid out. So sorry, Jacob, to get too far ahead of us on next week's issue.
No, I think that is a fair assessment. I think our rating was established with kind of an assumption that Majewski was more likely than not going to be the nominee, and that is a major change. I think that Erin, though, I would agree with you that within kind of the the confines of that kind of more competitive set of categories, I mean, Captor is an institution. She's got about 15 times as much money in the bank as Marin does. Marin, has perhaps a bit of a taint from the Larry Householder scandal that really rocked Ohio. He comes out of kind of that wing of the Republican Party that has had a lot of rockiness over the last couple of years in state politics. And of course, with Sherrod Brown at the top of the ticket, if Sherrod wants to win re-election, he's got to win this district, right? I mean, I think
Yeah.
he's got to. In 2018, when he won statewide by 6 or 7 points, I want to say that he won this one by like 15 or something like that. I mean, a lot of and call them ancestral Dems or whatever kind of label you want to use. But I think Biden's not going to win here, but Sherrod should win here, and that'll be a boost for Marcy Captor.
I'll also say that the pro-choice ballot amendment also was successful here, and a majority of Ohioans in the ninth supported it. So I think that will give another clue as to how Capture messages. She wasn't really focused on abortion at all that much last cycle, but I'm curious now that we're post that ballot amendment whether she'll focus on it a little more this cycle as a galvanizing issue.
We had a couple other primaries in Ohio that have basically selected the next member of Congress from their district. I'll just run through them real quick here so we can move on. In the second district, a very crowded Republican primary to succeed retiring Congressman Brad Wenstrup. David Taylor, who is a concrete company executive, won that primary. He spent about $1.7 million of his own money in that race to win with just 25% of the vote. And then in the sixth district, we had kind of a double barrel primary, special election primary, and general election primary to succeed Bill Johnson, who left to be the president of Youngstown State University. And that was won by Michael Ruley, who was a state senator from the Youngstown area. That turned into a little bit of a proxy war between the Republican Main Street Partnership and the House Freedom Caucus, which are two kind of wings of the GOP these days. I wouldn't call the Republican Main Street Partnership moderate necessarily, but perhaps a little less conservative than the House Freedom Caucus, a little bit more leadership friendly. So both
less provocative, definitely.
less provocative. Both Ruley and Taylor going to be headed to Congress. Ruley in a couple months, Taylor at the end of the year. We also had a Senate primary in Ohio, which is going to be one of the top contests on the map this fall.
Marino is damaged goods. That's why the Democrats are spending millions to prop up Marino in the Republican primary so Sherrod Brown can beat him in November.
MAGA alert. President Trump wants you to vote for outsider businessman Bernie Marino.
We now know who the Republican nominee is going to be to take on Senator Sherrod Brown in Ohio. It's going to be Bernie Moreno, who is a former car dealer and entrepreneur and businessman who won the primary with about 50% of the vote off of the strength of an endorsement from former President Trump. Moreno also ran for Senate in 2022. He dropped out at Trump's urging to help consolidate the field for J.D. Vance, but he did so clearly with an eye to 2024. Moreno's daughter, Emily Moreno, worked for Trump. She's married to Max Miller, who's a congressman from Ohio, who's a very pro-Trump congressman. Formerly, I believe, worked in the Trump White House. So Moreno has a lot of ties to Trump. Clearly, that endorsement helped, and it clearly helped him get past a scandal or late-breaking, embarrassing news story, I would say, about from the AP that linked an account on a adult website to to Moreno's profile. At least Moreno claims it was an intern that created the account as a prank. They produced the intern, and the intern said, "I'm the one who did it. It wasn't Moreno," but it was kind of an embarrassing story to break late in the race. Clearly did not prevent him from winning the nomination. And now he gets to take on Sherrod Brown in one of the two states that will likely determine control of the Senate majority.
Right. A couple of key points. In Sherrod Brown's last reelection, he defeated Republican Congressman Jim Renacci. Sherrod Brown outspent Jim Renacci by more than 2-1, $28 million to $13 million. That is not going to happen this time. He is not going to have that sort of fundraising advantage. As a candidate, Marino will be able to. He should be a better fundraiser than Renacci, but also he's going to have outside help. In Sherrod Brown's last race, Renacci did not have support from the committee or Senate Leadership Fund. Republicans are all in on Ohio and Montana. And so I think Sherrod Brown is going to overperform. He's going to do better than what Biden does. But I think that's going to come down to a more normal overperformance, while Ohio itself is shifting to be a little bit more Republican each cycle. And this is going to be a very difficult race for Senator Brown. We have it rated as a toss-up. And like you said, Jacob, it's one of the top two races in the country.
Yeah. And I do want to say though, right? I mean, we talk a lot about how, Senate races go exactly the way as the presidential. It's only happened one time in the last two presidential elections that a Senate race has gone the opposite direction from the presidential. That race, of course, Maine in 2020, a state that Joe Biden won by, I want to say 8 or 10 points, something like that. Susan Collins won her race by, I want to say something in that same area as well, 9 points. So Sherrod Brown only needs to put up half the overperformance that Susan Collins did in Maine in 2020 in order to win reelection. I don't know if he will or not. That's what the toss-up category is for. But it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility, out of the realm of recent election results. And that main race, of course, was highly engaged by both parties in terms of outside money. So very different states, Maine and Ohio, but not impossible for Sherrod to win at all.
Not impossible, but let's fight with stats, Jacob. If when I was talking about going from let's say if Sherrod Brown overperforms as much as what John Tester did in 2018 or Tammy Baldwin did in 2018, which according to our vote above replacement metric would be about 6.5 or 5 points, depending on one of those candidates, rather than 9, he had a VAR of 9. If it comes down to 6 or 5-ish and Ohio shifts a point or a point and a half, then that's probably Sherrod Brown coming up short. So yeah, if everyone is Susan Collins, no senator is ever going to lose, but Susan Collins really set the bar high.
Sure. I don't dispute that, but I think the baseline is measuring a slightly different thing than presidential overperformance. I think that state level Republicans tend to win by bigger margins in Ohio. I mean, Mike DeWine just won his reelection by what, like 25, 30 points or something crazy like that. Trump's not going to win by that much, but I think that my point is just it's possible, and we've seen it happen relatively recently, even in this midst of a massive decline in split ticket voting. We have seen that kind of hill surmounted. So we've also got some interesting primaries brewing in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Let's take a look at the 5th district. Here is Republican Congressman Bob Good talking about his Republican primary challenger.
The Cantor, McCarthy forces have aligned with millions of dollars with D.C. money and California money to fund this challenge by someone who's, I think, demonstrably willing to do or say anything to try to win an election.
Again, that was Congressman Bob Good, the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus. Erin, you just wrote a big story on all the races in the Virginia delegation, but talk to us specifically about that 5th district. Where is it, and what is going on here that Good is so worked up about his primary challenge?
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that Good might be the most vulnerable Republican member of Congress with a serious primary challenge this year. I mean, you've got a couple of interesting primaries where you have a more mainstream member who's facing a more MAGA candidate, like in Boss situation. And then you have what's happening kind of here with Good is that the 8 members who ousted McCarthy last year are now some of them facing serious primary challengers that are, believe it or not, backed by McCarthy. He has a bit of a vendetta that he is pursuing right now against all these folks, and I think Good is probably at the top of that list right now, and that's because Good has not only frustrated McCarthy but also Trump, because Good was one of the few members of Congress who backed DeSantis throughout his presidential campaign. And despite the fact that Good is very pro-Trump and immediately endorsed Trump after DeSantis dropped out, there is still a lot of bad blood there. The Trump campaign manager recently said that they were going to be going after Good. Trump has not personally gotten involved yet, but we still have a couple of months till the primary, and I think we can expect that he will. But yeah, this is going to be very difficult for Good. He faces State Senator John McGuire, whose name you may recognize. He has been around in a couple of races. He ran for the old version of Virginia's 7th district, Spanberg's district, back in 2020. He's run for a couple different offices as well and was actually just elected to the state Senate last year. And within a couple of days of being elected, he hadn't even been sworn in yet. He announced that he was running against Bob Good. So there's been a lot of drama with this race, and Good has had his own kind of drama within the Freedom Caucus, as chair of the Freedom Caucus, that he's been dealing with. Jen Kiggins is now fundraising for McGuire. And the reason this whole situation is also just kind of weird is that McGuire is quite far right. He was at the Capitol on January 6th, incredibly pro-Trump, But you have all of these more quote unquote mainstream Republicans like Jen Kiggins, like McCarthy, kind of falling in line behind him because they hate Bob Good. And so you have, to Jacob's point earlier, the Main Street Republican partnership, their super PAC is now going to be spending against Bob Good. They usually don't spend against incumbents at all, let alone for a challenger who is also pretty far to the right. So this has just like created a lot of weird alliances. But I think it's fair to say that Good will have a very difficult primary in a couple of months.
And this is a real kind of live by the sword, die by the sword moment for Bob Good, because
Yeah,
if we go back to 2020, he was the insurgent conservative challenger to a member, Denver Riggleman, who was seen as insufficiently pro-Trump and insufficiently conservative. Good
right.
ousted Riggleman at a at a firehouse primary, then faced a competitive general election, one that was redistricted into a safer seat, and now looks like he might lose to a primary challenge himself. And as I just learned, the guy that, in a true full circle moment, McGuire, who is now in the state Senate, his state assembly seat, guess who holds that now?
Oh, I don't know. Who holds it?
Tom Garrett,
Oh my gosh.
who was the congressman who held this seat
Yeah.
before Denver Riggleman.
Wow.
So it is,
There's
maybe
a lot of former members who are running for state legislative districts
they're just like
here.
5 people in the Charlottesville area. I don't know. And they all just keep running for the same offices. But
Yeah.
yeah, this is definitely going to be a primary to watch. I believe the Virginia primaries are coming up in June. I want to say like June 18th is when
Yeah.
all of this will go down.
And I'll also note that unlike the last 2 cycles, Republicans are doing a regular district-wide primary instead of having a convention or a firehouse primary. So Bob Good has never had to run in like a district-wide primary before. So that's another thing
That's
that's
crazy.
he's got going against him. He's going to have to campaign across the district in a primary setting that he hasn't had to before.
Yeah.
Whenever I think of Bob Good, though, I always think, I believe he came to Congress and was previously the assistant athletic director at Liberty University.
Yes.
But there was a list that came out about the salaries or the highest paid people at Christian colleges and universities. And it was fascinating to me. I went to a school in Orange County, California called Vanguard University. But the tight ends football coach at Liberty makes more than the president at Vanguard University, which puts a little bit in perspective about the size and the money that's being thrown around at some of these schools. The tight ends coach makes more than the president of Vanguard. So anyway, that doesn't apply to this election. I can't think of Bob Good without
Doesn't
thinking about
surprise
his
me at all.
previous position.
It's good to know that's where the money's going. And finally, our last segment, Look What I Found, where we highlight something new we've stumbled across. It could be political, sports, music, or something else entirely. You never know what you're going to get. Erin, what did you find this week?
I don't know if I found anything recently because a lot of artists that I actively listen to are releasing new music this spring. So it's a big season for me. So I haven't been doing a lot of discovering of new artists. But I've been listening to Casey Musgrave's new album a lot. I really like it. It's not as good as Golden Hour, but it'll do. And I have tickets to her concert in Baltimore this year, which is exciting. However, it's the Saturday after the election, and I'm like a little concerned that things may not be settled by then. So we'll see. We'll see if that pays off. But I'm hopefully things will be called by then.
Yeah, nothing big happened on the Saturday after the election 4
No,
years ago, right?
no, definitely not, right? So fingers crossed.
So I found an instant addition to the canon of St. Patrick's Day movies, that vast catalog, the Netflix
Is this the
original
Irish
movie
Wish?
Irish Wish, starring Lindsay Lohan. This movie is one of the most bizarre things that I've watched in recent memory. There's some theories going around online that it was like partially written by AI, and honestly, I believe it. It literally begins with a dictionary definition of the word wish. That is not even the real definition of the word wish. It definitely is like a so bad it's good kind of film. I've seen it described as a cross or a kind of the love child of Freaky Friday and Just My Luck, two other classic Lindsay Lohan movies. But if you've got like an hour and a half to kill, it's a real trip. I'd recommend it.
So I have a tradition with some friends where we, for the last couple of Good Fridays, have watched Dairy Girls together. Just I don't know. I don't remember how it started. It's just now a thing. But instead, this year we're going to be watching The Irish Wish. So I'm very excited to experience it. That's the only reason I haven't watched it yet. Otherwise,
Well, let me know what you think. Let me know
I
what you
will.
think.
Yeah, I definitely will.
I'm not taking any criticism or judgment for anything that I watch in the future. If you guys are
That's
watching
true.
this, I'm gonna watch
Fair.
anything I want with a clear conscience.
All right. So Nathan, what did you find?
So I found that I still love my one fantasy baseball team. My one fantasy baseball league, pre-marriage, pre-kids. I was in multiple football, baseball leagues. I dabbled in basketball and hockey, and I had to give all that up. But I've still got one team. It's great. It's called Dragon Force, which is a nod to the Dallas Dragons that we've all heard about before, but also Dragon Force, the power metal band by the same name. So we'll see. I haven't won the league in many, many years, but maybe this is the year for a comeback.
Do you have does your league have like a fun punishment for coming in last place?
No, I mean, you definitely don't win any money. But no, thankfully you have to get a tattoo of something where I'm not
You don't
that
have to
dedicated. I'm
sit
not
for
that
the
dedicated.
SATs or something like that.
No, that would probably change my priorities and how much time I spend on it. But no, it's fun. It's a good time.
At Inside Elections, we provide nonpartisan analysis of congressional, presidential, and gubernatorial races. With a combination of reporting and data, we break down the key races and bring valuable context to complex elections. Go to InsideElections.com to subscribe to the bi-weekly newsletter. We've got individual subscriptions and group packages that are tailored for association and corporate PACs. If you liked this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and rate us on your favorite platform. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you didn't like today's episode, please email Bernie Moreno's intern. We also wanted to thank our producers, Alan Tuzinski and Melissa Lenner of Pretty Easy Podcasts, and associate producer Conrad Tolosa. Please come back and join us again.